Hi, Brian. Welcome to the Uncharted Algorithm. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Wonderful. So, I wanted to start off by your background. So, your background is very different from most startup CEOs. I guess the Silicon Valley includes an active membership in the US intelligence community, serving the Middle East and also the White House, I believe, during the Obama administration before a stint at the CIA. So, it's very unusual. So, just if you could walk us through how you ended up in
Yeah.
Silicon Valley, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So I've had a nonlinear career path. Let's call it that. So I left a PhD program to join the CIA. This was about more than 15 years ago at this point, and joined as an intelligence officer. Like the opportunity to write classified assessments for the president every day was too good to pass up, and so I spent a number of years there as an intel analyst, both at Langley as well as in the Middle East. And then moved from CIA down to the White House to help run our foreign policy for Iraq and ISIS. This is during the time when ISIS was on the ascent in Syria and Iraq, and spent more than a year there working with President Obama at the time and Vice President Biden. And then my wife and I, we wanted to move back to California. It's where both of us are from. And I landed in San Francisco and had the opportunity to join an early stage startup focusing on natural language processing called Primer AI. This is right around the time that transformer models began to emerge. And was employee 20 or something like that, very early, newly minted Series A company, and just had an incredible opportunity to just immerse myself in the world of language models for the next 4 years at Primer as we tried to build knowledge graphs and workflows for enterprise customers on top of that. And it was really through those lived experiences at Primer on the model side that I saw a lot of the challenges on the data side, and which inspired me to found Unstructured.
Very interesting. So, just as of a curveball question, so what's your favorite spy TV show, I guess, that you watch? I know I was listening to one of your podcasts or interviews, and you said you love reading spy novels. I was just
Yeah.
curious what your favorite spy TV show is.
Oh man, on the TV show, I mean the Jack Ryan series
Yeah.
has been great. I think probably the favorite is Americans. Nothing's more realistic than the Americans. They did an amazing job with the Americans.
Yeah. Do you watch any anime by any chance? Or
You know what? A little bit, but I'm not deep on it. But would love to hear more.
so my son he watches this show called Spy Family. It's a really good anime series from Japan. Yeah. So
We got to put
definitely
that on the
highly
list.
recommend it.
I got three small kids, so we got to put that in the queue. That's a great recommendation.
Yeah, although I wouldn't recommend it for really small, maybe 11 plus. Yeah,
Got
it's
it.
a bit. Yeah.
That's great.
Anyway, so you mentioned about NLP. So going back to AI and how you got here, it's quite clear that there are lots of companies in the NLP space have been around for a while now. Well, a lot of the NLP companies I notice haven't successfully say pivoted to Gen AI or large language models. I mean, the initially every little task in NLP had a separate model, right? And now you have these large language models can generalize across multiple NLP tasks. And the NLP space is huge, right? I mean, it's been around for a while. So I was just curious. I mean, you obviously have successfully pivoted to Gen AI LLMs. So what was behind, or what was the thinking behind you making that pivot? I mean, you already saw that at Primer, or just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, look, I mean, rewinding in the clock, 3 4 years ago, you had two big economic challenges and practical challenges with NLP, and I'm oversimplifying it, but I think it's useful. The first is that, as you mentioned, you needed lots of small models to extract triples and do different classification tasks, and then pull that all together into a knowledge graph, and then put workflows on top of that. And that's why you saw an abundance of data labeling startups. You saw an abundance of model hosting, model serving startups, and Hugging Face exploded as a library for these models. And there was all kind of grapple with the challenges associated with that. The second was on the data side, is that even still today, you need chunk JSON, chunk Markdown to feed into the context window for these models. The context window used to be, less than 30 tokens. Now we're talking millions of tokens. But you still need typically chunk JSON, chunk Markdown in order to make this work. And no one really tackled that. And so there was, you couldn't walk more than 10 feet in San Francisco without a data labeling or a model serving startup during that time. And that's evolved. But you'd go to a large, investment bank or a government organization or a CPG company like Walmart, and they'd say, hey, the data that we want to use is PowerPoints, Google Docs, Slack messages, audio recordings. And there's absolutely nothing that to help the data scientists, solutions architects get that into nice chunk JSON to feed to those models. And so, from 2022 through today, you've seen things on the right side of that equation, on the model side of the equation, evolve very rapidly, which you articulated. You see nothing on the data side to actually help, from in practical terms to get the data, aside from like what we're building, and now there are some other folks in our ecosystem that are beginning to emerge, and so like on the vision initially for us was, in the first half of 2022, was that, hey, the Hugging Face community is just exploding. There's so much unmet demand, and they're starting to meet that demand on the model side. But like the bottleneck's is on the data side as well. Let's go solve that and serve the Hugging Face community. And so that's who we were building for initially. We still love that community and we're doing it, but it's just gotten even bigger right over the last year and a half, 2 years. And so that was like the initial thesis was like, let's go after those users and help them get the data to those models.
Right. And I believe you've just recently launched a platform which is more like enterprise friendly. So can you maybe talk about your sort of core value proposition? I know you have different products, but it'll be good to just hear what those are.
Yeah, so where we started with open source, and we still are supporting our open source, it's just a simple API. Raw file comes in, JSON with metadata comes back that you can then chunk. Right? And we have a commercial API analog to that, which does better table extraction, it does better form extraction, it's doing better element classification, et cetera. But you're still raw file in. If you're an organization that wants to continually hydrate, like a RAG architecture, or wants to tee up a bunch of data that might go into Snorkel or Datology for a fine-tuning task or a pre-training task, it's not enough just to do the file transformation. In many cases, what are we talking about here? We're talking about connectors, right? Like what Fivetran and Airbyte have done, but for these data sets, file transformation, chunking, summarization, vectorization, vector syncing, and then writing that to a downstream like location, and then having that run on some schedule, and and having different options there. And there's a lot of other things for these developers and data scientists that they have to worry about. They have to worry about how they're indexing their data. They got to worry about how they're retrieving the data. They got to worry about their LLM tuning parameters. And so the vision for platform is that raw to RAG ready data or raw to fine tuning ready data, you don't have to worry about it. You set the parameters that you want, and it's just working. And now you show up and you have that data parked in your Pinecone index or in your Weaviate index or an S3 or Mongo Atlas, right? And it's ready to go.
So talking about the stack, so the the LLM stack, and it's evolving. Obviously, it's still early days, but you mentioned the Hugging Faces, the LangChains to do the LLM integration. You have the vector databases. You have you guys possibly working across some of those functionalities, and then you also have the cloud AI providers like Microsoft, Google, AWS. How do you see that evolving, and how have you sort of noticed it evolving over the last, say, 6 months, and where do you see it going as it gets more and more evolved?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. There are some things that are not changing, which is I think as interesting as what is changing. And so, to first on what's not changing, we're not seeing a move. Like there's been some open questions on whether or not large context windows are going to obviate the need for RAG, and from everything we're seeing, that's not the case. From a total cost of ownership perspective, from a latency performance and a performance perspective, RAG is going to continue to be the dominant paradigm, and maybe RAG plus knowledge graphs. What is evolving very rapidly is the work that like Harrison's doing over at LangChain, what Jason's doing at Arise and others on observability. and around orchestrating agents as well as more traditional retrieval techniques in order to optimize the task of delivering exactly what you need to the context window and nothing more exactly when you need it, right? Because that's the game here. In order to like give a language or a foundation model the very best chance of being successful, like you don't want to give it noise, right? And you want to give it exactly what you need in the right order, right? And so from an observability standpoint on the right hand side of like the vector DB, like that's changing a lot. And so like on our side, like on the ingestion, pre-processing, and indexing side, it's getting more complicated around like what type of summaries you want to append, how you're going to embed, how you might want to chunk. But
Hmm.
that's more of like just getting it's no new variables being introduced. Instead, it's just a deeper understanding of those existing variables. On the right hand side of the equation, though, that's where we're seeing kind of an explosion of new tooling, and that tooling actually making a huge difference in the success of these architectures on whether or not they move to production or not. And so a lot of folks kind of getting involved in this, but that's where I think that there's like this interesting symbiosis between like as models become more performant, right, and then also like the observability and the orchestration and the interplay between those two. That kind of that's where we're seeing like a virtuous cycle. That's really really interesting, and I think it's going to be absolutely critical to continue that if we're going to increase like the percentage of wins that these developers have as they're trying to deploy these Gen AI solutions in their organizations.
Great. Can you walk us through a typical customer use case? And I was just curious. You talked about RAG and putting it into production. I guess maybe I'll change the question. Have you first of all seen companies getting RAG into production? I was just curious if there's any examples you can share. You don't have to share the name of the company, but I was just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I get three interesting examples. I think that for search and discovery, those are the use cases where they're being most successful. Glean's doing an amazing job of this right now with packaging it up, and there's homegrown solutions that look similar to this, that the models and the architectures are sufficiently mature that they these have a very high win rate in terms of making it into production and actually like delivering business value. The second is around like QA, like customer chatbots, for example, like question answer chat interfaces is really the dominant like kind of UX right now. And the if it has you know if you have the right data and you've done the right work grooming that data, those are you're able to move those into production. And then the third are some really interesting use cases. We've been working with a customer that's been using us to take all of their product research for like the last 20, 30 years, make it available to models. And then we're actually like, instead of doing process automation on the model, it's actually trying to get the model to hallucinate as much as possible off that data to dream up new product ideas and new product strategies. And on those more creative use cases, models are fantastic at that right now. And RAG's really well suited to that. It's that middle area between kind of QA chatbots and the creative use cases on like the multi-step process automation, things that might look more like RPA or multi-sequence agentic
Mhm.
kind of,
Yeah.
those are more challenging.
Yeah, I had a question on that as we go into, say, multi-agent, multi-steps. How is that going to change? So, how is that going to change your value proposition? I'm just curious. Any thoughts on that, or because it is coming down the pipe? I know it's still early days. I mean, and there's Devin and there's a few others. I mean, there's lots of noise, but how is that going to change things for ETL and within the LLM space?
I think that from a broad perspective here is that agents are going to make it easier to retrieve the right data and bring it back to the context window. And so there may be less work ahead of time on pre-processing everything and pulling it through. That could be the case. It could also be the case that the agents really work on more structured data around like crawling HTML or code bases, and they do that very, very well. And then you still kind of pre-position everything in a vector database and more of a horizontal capability, right, for them to go and find it. And when you're talking tens of billions of records, it's still very difficult to find exactly, or hundreds of billions of records, it's still very difficult to find exactly what you need very quickly, right? And so if they're having to go all the way back to SharePoint and native PDFs and PowerPoints, like that's going to be, from a latency standpoint, quite high. And so there's, I think, a distinction between like what is possible and what could you show on a demo, and then what is actually going to be practical for scaling across an organization of non-technical users that actually deliver. I mean, at the end of the day, what are you after? You're after productivity gains for your teams, right? And so it seems like we're still quite a ways away from them going and poring over raw files, pulling them through a transformation pipeline, or being able to handle them raw. Like, for example, like right now, we've done benchmarking, and if you were to just use like GPT-4 Turbo for PDFs, they're either missing or getting out of order more than 40% of the words. And they're a lot slower than more traditional approaches. And so it's going to take quite a bit of maturing in this space if you want to start using the generative models for non-generative purposes.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. And the other one was also around multimodal capabilities. As you get multimodal, gets better, I guess, is better at extracting charts and graphs and, things like that. I mean, the OCR thing kind of becomes defunct at some point. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that with regards to RAG and ETL?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different approaches here. In terms of like information density, text still has like the most information density. And so it's absolutely essential to extract that and render it in the right reading order without missed words, et cetera. And that's an extraordinarily difficult task, and that the generative models perform extremely poorly on that. However, on engineering schematics, flowcharts, pie charts, et cetera, they're fantastic. Like the Anthropic team just has done an incredible job, for example, in Claude 3 on this. And so what you want to do is you want to orchestrate the best tool for the right problem. And so like you have a choice, right? You could send it to, like, for example, through our platform, we can identify a schematic, automatically send it to an LLM, generate a rich text description that we nest in the correct reading order so you can find it in the right chunk, and then also embed the image of that itself. And so you can minimize information loss as you go from raw file to, data that you want to pre-stage somewhere, maybe in a vector database. And so I think like in reality is always different than Twitter. And like, for example, like right now, like the best in the world on information extraction from documents is Azure Document AI, I think is what they call it, the renamed Azure Form Recognizer. Yeah. It misses about less than 5% of the words on our benchmarking, whereas like the very best LLM, as I mentioned, is missing more than 40% of the words, and it's a lot more computationally expensive. However, dealing with those, engineering schematics and things like that, that's a perfect use case for a foundation model. And so the trick is orchestrating the right model for the right task. Like, you don't want to use LLMs for classification tasks, for example, on small, like at scale. It's the economics are just totally upside down.
I've noticed, like, playing around with Gemini 1.5 Pro because of its 1 million context window. I find it's doing pretty good job, especially for large documents extracting. You were mentioning GPT-4 only was pulling like 40% of the data. So again, you mentioned in one of your comments was that you don't think that the context window is really going to make a big difference. I was just curious why you thought that was the case. And any thoughts on? I mean, again, you're model agnostic. So any thoughts on the Gemini model? How that's doing?
Yeah, I guess. Look, where I kind of get lost on the large context windows is when we're talking to customers about use cases. The workflow that we rarely see a workflow where a user says, "I know exactly the file that I want and what I want it done," and then they go and they upload it to a model and ask questions in a chat, and then pull it back down and integrate it into what they're doing. That's just not how people work, right? Maybe in certain circumstances, there might be isolated circumstances where you do that, but like you haven't seen workflows transition to that with like anything that OpenAI introduced or Anthropic over the last 2 years. Instead, what you're seeing are copilots, right? That's how folks, they just want it imbued in your workflows, and it's just helping accelerate, like in your Gmail, where it helps predict the text afterwards, right? And so if that's going to be the dominant UX, is an accelerant to existing workflows, instead of I'm going to go find the file, upload the file, ask a question on the file, pull it down, then the question is, why do you need large context windows? Like what do you gain from that? Right. And this is why, like, I was excited, like with an 8K context window for Llama 3, like that's fine for most cases if you're going to use it as a co-pilot and pre-stage a lot of data in a vector database. And by a lot, I'm talking about billions and billions of records, right? And then pull exactly what you need, deliver to that context window to help accelerate workflows. And so,
Right.
and so we'll see if co-pilots do not, if you actually do have it where the user, is uploading data and they're going and finding the data themselves and uploading it. Okay, maybe. Otherwise, it's slow, it's expensive. You constantly have lost in the middle problems, which they're getting they're getting better, but I don't see a huge amount of value.
Yeah, maybe there are different use cases. I mean, obviously, when I use Gemini 1.5 Pro to, like help me read books, like really complex, like philosophy books, for example. So you maybe upload like a whole series of philosophy books by one author, and then maybe in the enterprise case, as you said, typically people don't know what file they're working with. So yeah, that makes sense. Any thoughts on synthetic data? I mean, lots of people talking about synthetic data, and will that change anything, or is that going to shift anything with pre-processing?
I think it has a disproportionate impact on model pre-training, maybe some on fine tuning, but you still have issues with overfitting that are really difficult and vexing to overcome if you're going to use synthetic data. And at the end of the day, the use cases here are really boring. It's like, Barbara in logistics who wants to know what's going on with this purchase order and this delivery, right? And, synthetic data is relevant for helping, fine tune that model using RLA, Chef or reinforcement learning with AI feedback, right? In order to like shape, the outputs in a way that's helpful for Barbara, right? But the other day, Barbara couldn't, like, synthetic data is not going to help her figure out what's going on with like a delivery that's going in customs or something like that, right? And so you're still going to need to take human generated data, a customs form, right, and that workflow, and then connect those. And so, look, we're seeing like an explosion of synthetic data as we're learning. But like, look, there's really interesting things going on. Like Llama 3 is not a mixture of experts model, right?
Yeah.
It's a single big model, and there's some really interesting conversations going on right now about convergence. Like as you encode additional information into these models, are they converging around the same sort of behaviors? And then the limiting factor begins, like, okay, how are we going to get more human generated data to these models?
In terms of the types of documents, is there you talked about, I mean, tables, you talked about charts, using multimodality. Is there something that is still kind of difficult to process? I mean, again, based on your own experience, what you see within enterprises, or even with the open source sort of developer community that is using it, where is the maximum sort of effort needed to make it work for an LLM?
Sure. The listeners will probably like roll their eyes at this, but like simple things are still unbelievably difficult. Take tables without lines demarcating columns and rows. LLMs still perform terribly at parsing those. And
Right.
and even like the state of the art table extraction models, like Microsoft's new table extraction model, which is great, ours that we're working on still really struggle. So if you want to get all of the tables out of a 10K, like an SEC 10K, nobody in the
Hmm.
world reliably.
Yeah.
So it's like things like that. A lot of the object detection tasks in documents are way more complicated than even like the self-driving car tasks from an object detection standpoint, just because of like the information density and like the
Mm.
heterogeneity of document layouts. It's just unbelievably difficult to infer hierarchy, to infer reading order, and to do extraction of like key value pairs, even, or identify key value pairs. those tasks, LLMs aren't great at it, and more traditional approaches are still far superior to LLMs, but still very, very difficult even to figure out how to label the data
Hmm.
for those tasks. And so there's things that they're old problems where performance is still actually pretty poor, where we got to get better at some of those old problems if we're going to move the ball on some of the newer ones. And so that's where we're spending a huge amount of time right now on, label data, playing with different ontologies, playing with different model architectures to try and crack that. Because if you don't have, if a table is completely garbled, the LLM can't piece it back together again. It's not going to work. So
Yeah, based on my own experience as well. I mean, I've been working on some projects looking at environmental sort of certification, permits, for example, in the US. Every state has their own sort of permit. And if you look at that, it's just not able to do it if it goes beyond, a certain type of complexity. Yeah,
yeah,
especially the table extraction is very, very hard. Great. I wanted to kind of move on to the future of AI. And as a founder, you've recently raised a Series B round. You laser focus on the Gen AI stack. And what might change in terms of, you talked a little bit about it in terms of the early discussion we are having with regards to Hugging Face, Pinecone. But in the next 12 months, I guess, are you going to see massive shifts generally in the startup space? Again, I'm kind of asking it more from a startup founder perspective. If somebody is a startup founder, where should they be working in? What area of the stack should they be focused on?
yeah. I think there's so much opportunity right now and so many interesting things going on right now on, in terms of the stack here, there's a lot of verticalized solutions that are beginning to emerge where, like Harvey, for example, on Legal Docs, that they're just crushing it. And like, I'm just like, like kudos to them. It's crushing it. Typeface are crushing it on marketing, Glean on search. That a lot of these more verticalized solutions are easier to scale at this point, given where the tech's at, and that there is a lot of enormous opportunity. OpenAI had a really interesting piece that they published this week about how, kind of in the biotech pharma space, like, you know, tailored Gen AI, tailored GPTs for different workflows. I think there's enormous opportunity there in terms of horizontal capabilities. We've seen an explosion of small companies kind of pop up. Like some people just focus on embeddings and vectors. Others just focus on chunking. Some just focus on certain types of indexing on the search side. And it's just very intense competition from a vertical standpoint. And you're starting to see a little bit of consolidation. Like, Lengthflow was recently acquired by DataStax and other. And so we're seeing that. I still think on like some of the interesting work that Datology and Clean Lab and Nomic are doing around dataset curation for model fine tuning and model pre-training. I think that there's a lot of room to run there still. A huge amount of run there. I think the work that like Harrison and Langchain are doing around observability and orchestration and around agents, like, Adept leapt out to a lead on this, and they were really early in the space. But I think that there's huge opportunity around agents, and then I think just new UXs. I don't know if chat is going to continue being the dominant paradigm here from a UX standpoint, and I think there's opportunities to really push things forward in terms of like, how this is actually imbued into products and realized. And like Perplexity has done some really interesting things there, right, with
Yeah.
reimagining search.
Yeah, no, I love Perplexity. I was curious, again, you have a background in government and the intelligence community. How is that community different from, I don't know, you've done some work with them as well with regards to offering them these ETL platform for I guess LLMs. What are their requirements compared to say what a sort of an typical enterprise requirement would be?
Well, the interesting thing is just the convergence and how quickly they've caught up over the last several years. And so where we're at in the stack, and this is one of the reasons that I love where we're at. We're kind of buried deep in the stack. A PowerPoint's a PowerPoint, a PDF's a PDF, right?
Yeah.
HTML is HTML, and so the requirements are indistinguishable. And they, in the classified space, they still have multi-cloud. They have GCP, AWS, Azure, Oracle, right? And so we've seen it converge. Whereas when I was doing this 5 years ago, everything was in bare metal and you didn't have cloud infrastructure. And so it was
Mm.
very, very difficult to operate. That's changed radically. However, on the workflow side and on the at the application layer, it couldn't be more different. And so, very different kind of you, you know, from a
Mm.
value proposition, same sort of thing. But from a practical standpoint, you're talking about command and control applications and intelligence operation applications, which is serve a different customer and have different workflows associated with it and different kind of mission requirements. And so
Mm.
other companies like Primer, where I used to work, Vannevar Labs, Scale AI's Donovan, and then like Yurts, which is another leader in this space, are doing really interesting work at the application layer, which is pretty specific to those particular domains. But where we're at, kind of deep in the stack, it's pure dual use technology. It's the exact same code base that we use for enterprise customers inside and outside of government.
Great. I guess in terms of talking about a bigger picture, more of sort of the philosophy. I mean, there's a lot of debate happening with regards to the effective altruists versus the EAC, techno-optimists. And so I was curious, with your intelligence and government background, but also a Silicon Valley startup CEO, I was curious where your sort of allegiance lies, or where your thinking lies. Are you are you EAC, or are you EA, or in the middle somewhere?
Look, I think that technology is neither good nor bad. It's how it's used, but it only goes in one direction. There's some really interesting kind of like ethical, considerations at play right now with regard to like how hardware is utilized, like in Ukraine, for example, on the need for or difficulty using like non-autonomous like kamikaze drones and things like that, right? And so we're seeing kind of warfare kind of move in that direction, and there will be some like very difficult decisions on, you know, what's going to be necessary in order to compete with our adversaries, and then also what we ought to do. I think that the Pentagon's done a very good job on formulating a responsible AI framework and stress testing that and then applying that. However, the world's evolving very, very quickly and more quickly than we ever could have imagined. And so I think that continuing to have a robust discussion and have all the tables ideas around the table is going to be essential in order to navigate this effectively. That balances both like our security, which is of paramount importance, but also our ethics and our values, right? And so I don't think
Hmm.
that there's one answer to this. I don't come down hard in one camp or the other. I think it's scary on a lot of these things, but it's also scary if bad actors have this technology as well, but you can't put a lid on it, right? This isn't like a nuclear program or something like that where you can, even that didn't work. When we put it down in New Mexico, the Russians had it the next year. But and so what is not up for dispute is that this is the pace of development and the need to continue to grapple with these issues in an urgent way, in a serious way, and one where we're able to drive consensus and have a shared view across like the public on this, which will never happen, but I think we should always strive towards that. And so, look, I don't fall into one camp or the other. I think I am I don't want to say like a cynical realist, but like I was trained to see every side of that was
Yeah.
one thing that I did learn at the CIA was like you have to be able to flip arguments inside and out and look at them from a 360-degree view. And when you're used to doing that, you're never really satisfied. And so that's where I kind of sit.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess last question was around, again, it's kind of related to what I asked, but in general, Silicon Valley has had a very difficult relationship with DC, with
Yep.
regulation and with government, I guess. There's always been sort of mistrust traditionally, but I'm seeing that now. For example, I mean, the large tech giants, obviously, they deal at a different level. They obviously are very involved with regulation, but for the startup side, for startup CEOs, or even VCs, I see there's like kind of a realization that we need to be active. We need to be kind of lobbying, and with some of the efforts that, for example, A16Z is doing now, and being more active in DC. Again, with your background, you've been in DC for some time. You're now in Silicon Valley. Do you see that as a sort of a benefit that you have there, where you can possibly straddle both these places, and again come to some sort of a balanced view on things, and maybe help out in some
Yeah,
way.
absolutely. I think that really the low point was after Google pulled out of Project Maven, 5, 6 years ago. And that was when I think relations reached their nadir, right? Their lowest point. Now it's really interesting. A16Z has their American Dynamism Fund. There's a lot of defense tech focused funds, one of which is invested in us, Shield AI, which is led by Mike Brown, former head of Defense Innovation Unit, an amazing partner to us. I think more broadly, what you're seeing is our government leaders frequently coming out to Silicon Valley and meeting with startups. And what you're seeing are a lot more startups that are investing in public sector, but then also investing in discussion. And there's just a lot more space for discussion. And so like just, last fall, the Senate, had, a whole multi-day set of hearings where they invited startup founders to weigh in on responsible AI frameworks that were being debated. The executive branch did some great work on executive orders where it was very inclusive of startups. I remember, like Clem from Hugging Face participated, Alexander from Scale participated, et cetera. And so I think that there's a lot more mechanisms for dialogue today than there were in, call it like 2018, 2019, 2020. And you're seeing the benefits of that. You're seeing capital pour into these companies. You're seeing engagement from startup founders, and you're seeing a lot less crosstalk than you did before. And so overall, it's on a far healthier trajectory than what we saw, during that last phase.
Hmm. Great. I think that's it. Ryan, appreciate you taking the time,
Yeah.
and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.